My name is Tyler and this happened 3 years ago when I was 26 years old. I was working as a delivery driver for a regional shipping company in Oregon, and part of my route took me through some pretty isolated areas along the coast. The Pacific Northwest is known for its fog, especially in the fall and winter months, but what I experienced that November night was something I still can't fully explain. Story 1, the Coastal Highway. I had been doing this route for about 8 months at that point, so I knew the roads pretty well. The Coastal Highway between Newport and Florence was one of my regular drives, usually twice a week. It's a beautiful stretch during the day, cliffs on one side, ocean on the other, dense forest everywhere else. But at night, especially in fog, it's a completely different experience. This particular night, I left the Newport distribution center around 9 p.m. I had maybe 6 or 7 deliveries to make before I could head back. The weather forecast had mentioned possible fog, but I'd driven through fog on that route dozens of times before. It was part of the job. About 20 minutes into the drive, the fog started rolling in. At first, it was just wisps across the road, the kind that catches your headlights and then disappears. But within maybe 10 minutes, it got thick. Really thick. I slowed down from 55 to about 35, then down to 25. Visibility was maybe 15 feet ahead of me, if that. The fog was so dense that my high beams just reflected back at me, making it worse, so I switched to low beams. The road was completely empty. No other cars. No streetlights out there either, just darkness and fog pressing in from all sides. I'd been driving for maybe another 15 minutes when I saw something in the road ahead. At first, I thought it was a deer. We got a lot of deer on that route. But as I got closer and slowed down even more, I realized it was a person. A man, standing in the middle of the road, facing my direction. I stopped the van completely, maybe 30 feet from him. I sat there for a second, waiting for him to move. He didn't. He just stood there in my headlights, perfectly still. I couldn't see his face clearly because of the fog, but I could see his outline. He was wearing what looked like a dark coat or jacket. His arms were at his sides. I honked the horn. Not aggressively, just a quick tap to let him know I was there. He didn't move. I honked again, longer this time. Still nothing. At this point, I was getting annoyed more than scared. I rolled down my window and yelled, "Hey! You need to move." No response. He just stood there. I thought maybe he was drunk or having some kind of medical emergency. I put the van in park and turned on my hazard lights. I opened the door and stepped out onto the road. The fog was even thicker outside the van. Cold and damp. I could barely see 10 feet in front of me. "Hey!" I called out again. "Are you okay? Do you need help?" The man didn't respond, but I saw him tilt his head slightly, like he was listening. I took a few steps toward him, and that's when I noticed something that made my stomach drop. There were more people. Standing in the fog behind him. Just barely visible. Maybe 4 or 5 of them, all standing perfectly still, all facing my direction. I stopped walking immediately. "What's going on?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. None of them moved. None of them spoke. They just stood there in the fog like statues. My brain was trying to rationalize it. Maybe it was some kind of protest. Maybe they were trying to block the road for some reason. But that didn't make sense. There was nothing out here. No houses, no businesses, just highway and forest. I took a step backward toward my van. As soon as I moved, the man in front took a step toward me. Just one step. Then he stopped again. My heart started pounding. I took another step back. He took another step forward. I turned and ran back to the van. I jumped inside, slammed the door, locked it, and threw the van into reverse. As I backed up, I kept my eyes on the figures in the fog. The man in front started walking toward me. Not running. Walking. Slow and deliberate. The others behind him started moving too, all at the same pace, all in perfect sync. I reversed maybe 50 feet, then did a 3-point turn as fast as I could. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely grip the steering wheel. As I turned the van around, I looked in my rearview mirror. The figures were still walking toward me, but they were fading into the fog. I couldn't see them anymore after a few seconds. I drove back the way I came, way faster than I should have in that fog. I didn't care. I just needed to get away from there. When I got back to a part of the highway that had cell service, I pulled over and called my supervisor. I told him what happened and said I wasn't completing the route. He wasn't happy about it, but I didn't care. He told me to come back to the warehouse. The next day, I filed a report with the company and called the local police department. I told them exactly what I saw and where. The officer I spoke to sounded skeptical but said they'd send someone to check it out. He asked me if I'd been drinking or using any substances. I told him no, absolutely not. A few days later, the officer called me back. He said they'd driven the route and didn't find anyone on the road or any evidence that anyone had been there. He suggested that maybe I'd seen some kind of optical illusion caused by the fog in my headlights. He said fog can play tricks on your eyes, make you see things that aren't there. I didn't argue with him, but I know what I saw. Those weren't optical illusions. Those were people. And the way they moved, all together, all in sync, that wasn't natural. I quit that job 2 weeks later. Told them I found something closer to home. I couldn't drive that route anymore. Even thinking about it made me anxious. 3 years later, I still think about it sometimes. Who were those people? What were they doing out there in the middle of the fog? And why did they all move toward me like that? I'll never know. And honestly, I don't want to know. Story 2, The Hiking Trail. My name is Rachel and this happened last year when I was 29. I'm an avid hiker. I've been hiking since I was a kid, and I try to get out on trails at least once or twice a month, sometimes more if I have the time. I live in Washington State, and there are endless trails around here. Some are crowded and well-maintained, others are more remote and quiet. I usually prefer the quieter ones. This happened in early March. I had a rare 3-day weekend and decided to do an overnight hike on a trail I'd been wanting to try for a while. It was about 2 hours from my apartment, up in the Cascade foothills. The trail was supposed to be moderately difficult, about 12 miles round trip, with a campsite at the 6-mile mark. I checked the weather forecast multiple times and it looked clear, maybe some clouds, but nothing serious. I set out early Saturday morning, around 7 a.m. The first few hours of the hike were perfect. The trail was well marked, the weather was cool but not cold, and I only passed maybe 3 other hikers the whole morning. I reached the campsite around 1 p.m. It was a small clearing with a fire pit and a few flat spots for tents. There was no one else there, which I was happy about. I liked the solitude. I set up my tent, ate some lunch, and spent the afternoon exploring the area around the campsite. There were a few smaller trails that branched off from the main one, and I followed one of them for maybe half a mile before turning back. By the time evening came, I was the only person at the campsite. I made a small fire, heated up some food, and sat there watching the sun go down through the trees. Around 8:30 p.m., I noticed the fog starting to roll in. It came fast, much faster than I expected. Within maybe 20 minutes, the whole area was blanketed in thick, gray fog. I could barely see 15 feet past my campfire. The trees around me just disappeared into the white. It was eerie, but not scary. I'd camped in fog before. I put out the fire, cleaned up my food, and got into my tent. I figured I'd read for a bit and then go to sleep. I was lying in my sleeping bag, reading by headlamp, when I heard something outside. Footsteps. Slow and deliberate, crunching on the leaves and twigs around the campsite. I froze and turned off my headlamp. I sat there in the darkness, listening. The footsteps continued. They were circling the campsite, moving slowly around the perimeter. I could hear them clearly, someone was definitely out there. I assumed it was another hiker who'd arrived late and was setting up their tent. That happened sometimes. People hiked at all hours. I turned my headlamp back on and unzipped my tent. I stuck my head out and called, "Hello?" The footsteps stopped immediately. I waited a few seconds, then called out again. "Hey, is someone there?" No response. I crawled out of my tent and stood up. The fog was so thick I could barely see my own tent. I turned my headlamp toward where I'd heard the footsteps, but I couldn't see anything. "If you need help or want to share the campsite, that's fine." I called out. "I just want to know who's there." Still no response. I stood there for maybe a minute, listening. It was completely silent now. No footsteps. No rustling. Nothing. I convinced myself that maybe it had been an animal. A deer or an elk. They were common in these woods. I went back into my tent and zipped it up. I sat there for a while, listening, but I didn't hear anything else. Eventually, I lay back down and tried to sleep. I don't know what time it was when I woke up, but it was still dark. I woke up because I heard something. Not footsteps this time. Breathing. Heavy, labored breathing, right outside my tent. I sat up immediately, my heart pounding. I grabbed my headlamp but didn't turn it on. I just sat there in the darkness, listening. The breathing was close. Really close. It sounded like someone was standing right next to my tent, maybe a foot away from the fabric. I didn't move. I barely breathed. I just sat there, frozen. Then I heard a voice. A woman's voice, quiet and hoarse, like she was whispering. She said, "Are you alone?" My blood went cold. I didn't answer. I didn't make a sound. A few seconds passed, then she said it again, slightly louder. "Are you alone?" I still didn't respond. I was too terrified to speak. Then I heard the footsteps again, moving away from my tent. Slow and deliberate, crunching through the leaves. They faded into the fog, and then it was silent again. I sat there in my tent for the rest of the night. I didn't sleep. I didn't even move. I just sat there with my headlamp in my hand, waiting for the sun to come up. As soon as there was enough light to see, I packed up my tent as fast as I could. I didn't eat breakfast. I didn't make coffee. I just grabbed my stuff and started hiking back down the trail. The fog was still thick, but I didn't care. I just wanted to get out of there. I made it back to the trailhead in less than 3 hours, way faster than it should have taken. I didn't stop once. I just kept moving. When I got back to my car, I sat there for a long time, trying to process what had happened. I kept telling myself that maybe it was just another hiker who was confused or disoriented. Maybe they were lost. But I didn't believe that. The way she asked if I was alone, there was something wrong about it. Something predatory. I reported the incident to the park service when I got home. They thanked me for the information and said they'd send rangers to check the area. A few days later, I got a call from a ranger. He told me they'd searched the campsite and the surrounding trails but didn't find any evidence of anyone else being there. He asked me if I'd actually seen the person or just heard them. I told him I only heard them. He suggested that sound can do strange things in fog, that echoes can make it seem like someone is closer than they are. He said it was possible I'd heard an animal or even another camper from further away. I didn't argue with him. But I know what I heard. That was a human voice. And whoever it was, they were standing right outside my tent. I haven't been back to that trail since. I probably never will. Story 3, The Ferry Crossing. My name is David and this happened 5 years ago when I was 32. I was living in Seattle at the time and working as a consultant, which meant I traveled a lot for work. One of my regular trips was to the Olympic Peninsula, usually once or twice a month. The fastest way to get there from Seattle is by ferry. You drive onto the boat, cross the Puget Sound, and drive off on the other side. It takes about 35 minutes. I'd taken that ferry dozens of times. It was routine. I'd usually grab a coffee, sit in my car or go up to the passenger deck, and work on my laptop during the crossing. This particular trip was in late October. I had a meeting on the peninsula the next morning, so I was taking the evening ferry. I think it was the 7:30 p.m. departure. When I got to the terminal, there weren't many cars waiting. It was a weeknight and later in the evening, so that wasn't unusual. I'd say there were maybe 10 or 12 vehicles total. I drove onto the ferry, parked on the lower deck, and went upstairs to the passenger area. There were only a handful of people up there, a couple sitting together, an older man reading a newspaper, and a woman on her phone. The ferry departed on time. As we pulled away from the terminal, I noticed the fog. It was rolling in thick across the water. Within maybe 5 minutes, we were completely surrounded by it. You couldn't see anything. Not the shore we'd left, not the shore we were heading toward. Just gray fog in every direction. The ferry felt like it was moving through nothing. Like we were suspended in a void. I went back to my laptop and tried to work, but the fog was distracting. There's something unsettling about being on the water and not being able to see anything. About 15 minutes into the crossing, I heard someone shout from the deck outside. I looked up and saw the woman who'd been on her phone. She was standing at the door to the outside deck, staring out into the fog. I couldn't hear what she'd shouted, but she looked upset. She turned and started looking around the passenger area, like she was trying to find someone. The older man with the newspaper asked her if she was okay. She said something to him, but I couldn't hear it. He stood up and followed her to the door, and they both looked out into the fog. I got up and walked over to them. "What's wrong?" I asked. The woman turned to me, her face pale. "There's someone out there," she said. "Out where?" I asked. "In the water." I saw someone in the water. My stomach dropped. I looked out through the door. The fog was so thick I could barely see the railing, let alone the water. "Are you sure?" the older man asked. "Yes," she said. "I saw them. They were just floating." The older man went to find a crew member. The woman stayed at the door, staring out into the fog. I stood next to her, trying to see what she'd seen, but there was nothing. Just fog and darkness. A crew member came over, a younger guy in a ferry uniform. The woman explained what she'd seen. He looked skeptical but said he'd radio it in. He pulled out a radio and spoke to someone, probably the captain. I couldn't hear what was said, but after a moment he nodded and put the radio away. "We're going to slow down and do a sweep of the area," he told us. "If there's someone out there, we'll find them." The ferry's engines changed pitch. We were definitely slowing down. The crew member went outside onto the deck with a flashlight. A few of us followed him, including the woman, the older man, and me. The fog was even thicker outside. Cold and wet. The crew member swept his flashlight across the water, but the beam just disappeared into the gray. We stood there for maybe 5 minutes, all of us scanning the water, but there was nothing. No one in the water. No debris. Nothing. The crew member radioed again. Another crew member joined him, and they both swept the area with flashlights. After about 10 minutes, they told us to go back inside. They said they hadn't found anything and the ferry was going to continue. The woman who'd reported it looked shaken. She kept insisting she'd seen someone. The crew member was polite but clearly didn't believe her. We went back inside. The ferry resumed normal speed. I sat back down, but I couldn't focus on my work anymore. I kept thinking about what she'd said. Someone floating in the water. About 5 minutes later, I heard another shout. This time from outside. I looked up and saw the older man. He was at the door again, pointing out into the fog. "There," he shouted. "I see them too." Several of us rushed to the door. The crew member came back out with his flashlight. "Where?" he asked. "Right there," the older man said, pointing into the fog. "About 20 feet out. I swear I saw someone." The crew member shone his flashlight in that direction. Again, nothing but fog. But then I saw it. Just for a second. A shape in the water. Pale and motionless. Then it was gone, swallowed by the fog. "Did you see that?" I asked the crew member. He didn't answer. He was staring at the same spot, his flashlight still pointed that direction. Then we all saw it again. Closer this time. A figure in the water, floating face up. Pale skin. Dark hair. Just drifting alongside the ferry. The crew member grabbed his radio. "We have a possible person in the water," he said, his voice tense. "Starboard side, approximately 20 feet out." The ferry slowed again. More crew members appeared. They were all on the deck now, sweeping with flashlights and looking into the fog. But as quickly as the figure had appeared, it was gone again. We couldn't see it anymore. The crew members spent another 15 minutes searching. They even deployed a spotlight from the upper deck, but it didn't help. The fog was too thick. Eventually, they called it off. The captain made an announcement over the PA system saying that they'd received reports of something in the water but hadn't been able to confirm anything. He said the Coast Guard had been notified and would sweep the area. The ferry continued to the terminal. When we docked, we were all questioned by Coast Guard personnel. They took statements from everyone who'd seen something, the woman, the older man, and me. I told them exactly what I'd seen. A pale figure floating in the water, there one moment and gone the next. They thanked me and said they'd investigate. I never heard anything after that. I checked the news for weeks, looking for any reports of someone drowning or a body being found in the Sound. Nothing. I took that ferry many times after that, but I never took the evening crossing again. I always made sure to go during the day. Because I know what I saw in that fog. We all saw it. And whatever it wasn't natural.